I think you spend your entire career trying to find out why you're writing. And that is, in some ways, what writing is about. Trying to find out why it feels like you have to do it. You know, why you don't feel very good if you don't write for a certain amount of time. So it has to do with some kind of understanding yourself, I guess, or understanding, you know, yourself through the world, or the other way around. So the only thing I know is I don't feel very good if I haven't been working for a long time. My first, how should I put it, voluntary attempt at writing, I was probably, 10 or 11, and I think at around 14 or 15 I started writing, really dedicated to it. And I started writing poetry because I was convinced that I was going to be a poet. I was going to be a very, very poor poet struggling through life. I'm still struggling, but I'm not a poet. But at the age of 18 or around that time, I just discovered that I couldn't be a poet. I think the poems I wanted to write had already been written. The poets I was reading all the time, I couldn't compete with it in a way. And so, almost by accident, my text got longer and longer. And I think I realized that prose was where my heart really was, and that the whole poet thing was more a question of image or attitude that I really didn't belong to. I find it hard to read fiction while I'm writing, and that is, it's a little bit sad for me because I'm almost always writing, and it means that most of the hard reading I probably did when I was in my 20s. So now I read the occasional novel or short story collection or collection of poetry or whatever, but I'm constantly asked, oh, have you read this one? Have you read that one? You have to read this one. It's only 120 pages. And I keep telling people that it hasn't anything to do with how long the book is. It has to do with the fact that, for me at least, if I read something and it's good, it starts to rub off on my own literature. And I know a lot of writers have it the other way. For instance, my Norwegian colleague and friend Johan Harstad is the complete opposite. He reads a lot, and he has to read, he feels, I think. And he has to find a way to do it, but I can't do it. So I read a lot of stuff that is, how should I put it, non-intrusive in a way, like non-fiction or research material. It's sad because you become a writer because you love reading, and then you can't read. Well, Max, Mischa and the Tet Offensive is very much a product of just researching, but also just reading stuff, I think. It's a book that came about through the accumulation of a lot of stuff I just happened to read about. It is a story about Max Hansen, who grows up in the city of Stavanger as a kid, and he has this idea that he's going to live his whole life there. Because even though it's a sort of a shitty suburb, it's his suburb, these are his streets. So he has this love for this place, and he really wants to be old there. And then at the age of 13, his parents decide to move to the other side of the world, to Long Island, New York, because his father, an airline pilot, has gotten a new job there. So against his will, he's transplanted really to the US, or he's forced into exile. And in the US, he has to create his own existence all over again. He has to find new streets to call his own. He has to find new friends, a new way of speaking, a new way of living his life. And so the bulk of the book is his 25 or so years in the US and reflecting on them, and how he slowly became an American and lost his inner Norwegian, I think, and never really having admitted to himself that he's never going back, because he always had this plan that one day he would be going back. But he realizes in the beginning of the novel that it's too late. And that is the big question the novel tries to ask: how long can you be gone before it's too late to go back? And naturally also, it's also a story, of course, about all the people he meets in the US, like his best friend Mordecai, who he goes to school with, who introduces him to Mischa, who's a painter 7 years older than Max, and their relationship. And then there's Uncle Owen, or Ove as he's called, who is the opposite of Max, because he voluntarily migrated to the US in the late 60s, wanting to become a jazz pianist, only to realize that he's too late for the jazz movement he wanted to be a part of, and he can't improvise, so he can't be a jazz musician, which again leads him to having to sign up to go to the Vietnam War in order to get a green card to be able to stay in, to become a US citizen. It felt natural for me to have Max move from Norway to the US for a couple of reasons. I wanted him to go somewhere which was far enough to make it difficult for him to go back, for a weekend or for a vacation. I wanted him to lose contact with all his friends. I had to sort of make a clean cut. And also the US felt natural because, as most Norwegians or Scandinavians or European, we are so overfed with American culture that it feels very, very close to us. We know all the music and the films and literature. We're so saturated with the American culture that it feels almost like home, until you go there and realize that all these tiny differences are actually big and important. And then again, there's this centuries-long relationship between Norway and the US. And I've also visited, gone to Iowa or Minnesota, and you meet these people who still refer to themselves as Norwegians, or like 100% Norwegian, and they speak in this strange, obsolete vernacular in a way. And it's like meeting ghosts, because they used to be Norwegian, but they're so cut off from it. And they'll offer you, pastries, for instance, which hasn't been made in Norway for 100 years. It's like time just stopped. And I wanted Max to be a part of that. I wanted him to become a Scandinavian ghost in a way. And also I wanted to take the opportunity to force myself to fall in love with the US. There's this, at least I feel to some extent in Norway, that if you happen to lean to the left, politically wise, you should be almost disinterested in the US. But I felt that I needed to understand it a little bit more. It doesn't mean that I have to embrace everything about it. And when I say learn to love the country, it doesn't have to mean I have to, love whoever's leading it, especially at this point. Which is not a good question. Would I have set the novel in the US if Trump was president? I'm not so sure.
Why not?
Because, that would just complicate matters in ways I can't even begin to describe. What happened when I was writing the novel was I was trying for a long time to figure out what kind of jobs these characters should have, what kind of persons are they. And I've always been very fond of my characters having almost mundane jobs. There's working as a garbage collector or a gardener or whatever. I never wanted them to be artists in any way, because usually I find it quite boring. But it was, with this novel, it was one of those cases where at some point it just feels like I'm struggling to not make them artists, and that felt a little bit fake as well. So when I decided that Max should be a theater director or even a playwright, I needed to have some texture to go along with it. And the same with Uncle Owen as a musician, and especially with Mischa as a visual artist. I needed to give it some texture so that it wasn't just me telling the reader that these are artists. I had to create artists in a way, which for Max meant I had, if not to write these plays, but I had to construct plays that would be performable. I had like one of the plays in the book called Napoleon Wants to Stay Up a Little Longer was actually almost going into pre-production as an actual play, and I decided no, I'll put it in a novel instead. And the same with Mischa's paintings. I figured out pretty soon, I think, that okay, if I'm going to talk about these pictures, I have to do it in a way that how should I put it, is believable in a way. And I'm not a visual artist, or, well, I wasn't at that point anyway. So I had to create them. And this was also an excuse not to write for a while, you know, because writing is hard. So I decided, okay, I'll create digitally 4 paintings, because I also do a lot of work as a graphic designer. So I did 4 paintings, which enabled me to describe them in more detail, because suddenly they were, you know, if not physical, but they were available to me as a visual reference. And I had so much fun with that I think I stopped writing for like 3 or 4 months and just did a lot of paintings and stuff for the project. And I didn't intend to use it or anything other than having them as a reference, which made it so much easier to write about it, because now it suddenly all existed, you know, the plays and the paintings, etc. It's an interesting question about the musical references or the pop culture references in the Max Mischa book, or in my books in general, because it's a question I get quite a lot, and on one hand I'm surprised by it, and on the other hand I'm not. I'm a little surprised by it because I never considered myself a writer that, you know, throws in all these pop culture references, because I don't think about it in that way. It's not a Nick Hornby project trying to, you know, name drop stuff. It's there because the music we listen to or the movies we're watching are part of life, so it feels as you know, normal to describe this as describing the weather outside, or describing how the streets looks, or how this person looks, etc. I get always these references about the pop culture things, but there's also a lot of other stuff in there. You know, there's all these references to Rothko, for instance, or to, you know, jazz from 1961, or stuff that isn't really pop culture at all. And there's equal amounts of that, but, you know, the pop culture references are more accessible in a way. But I really want to stress that when I'm writing, I'm not sitting there thinking, okay, I need to name drop a band or two here. It happens very naturally, and I'll take out a lot of stuff if it doesn't have any importance. But for instance, say I'm writing about Max meeting Mischa, and for me it feels like, you know, I can almost hear the sound from the stereo blasting out the Husker Du song. Then I have to mention it, otherwise it feels fake, like I'm trying to protect the novel from being dated, which I think is why a lot of writers, you know, eradicate all the references to pop culture, because they want to be read in about 100 years. But I think in 100 years you'll be able, you know, you can Google this stuff. The book was started almost at the exact same time as the first volume of Karl Ove Knausgård's My Struggle came out in Norway. And my initial reaction to that was, I want to write fiction. I tried a couple of times, you know, in very small portions in my earlier books to write about myself, write like autofiction, and I can't do it. It's just not for me. It feels like I lose these stories. And it's not that I believe that, like, you know, reality fiction or autofiction is more true than fiction or the other way around. I think everything is, you know, everything has its potential, everything has its limits. But in a time where it felt that autofiction was hailed as the new, you know, the big new thing and the salvation for literature or art in general, it felt necessary to say, wait a minute, maybe there could also be something about fiction that gets you as close or even closer to truth than autofiction, because now you don't have to be afraid to expose yourself, because you can write as true about yourself as you want, but every person has, you know, limits for what you want to expose about yourself, even our good man Knausgård. So even though I had and still have the greatest respect for his project, I could never do anything like that. So what I decided to do was to set the beginning of the novel in the same streets, in the same places, with similar characters to myself, and then change everything, so that it wouldn't be autobiographical in any way, shape, sense, or form. And if you read the novel very, very closely, you'll see that there is actually a kid named Johan that turns up fairly early, and it's said, you know, he's only there for 2 or 3 lines, so if you blink, you'll miss him. And it says that we never heard anything about him after that. But even those 3 lines about him are fiction, so it's not me either. But I wanted to put it in there to make it very, very specific that this book is not about me. But what I mean about fiction also being able to get you even closer or as close to reality as autofiction is that in these 11 or 1200 pages or whatever it is, in all these characters, I as a writer, as a person also exist. You know, there's a little bit of me in Max, there's a little bit of me in Mischa, there's a little bit of me in Owen, etc., etc. So in many ways, it also feels that it's my most personal novel, I think. So, you know, to the degree that anyone's interested, I'm in there, but I'm also hiding, and I think that works for me.